Much of what's said, everything that's been said here is quite interesting, as is much of that we read in the newspapers about election results and election analysis. But the fundamental problem in almost every media article, in almost every presentation, is the assumption that the count is correct. Yet those who take the time to learn about the way elections are conducted in this country find that it's not only a possibility in the U.S., indeed, it's hard to imagine any crime for which there is greater means, motive, and opportunity than election theft. If you think back to Election Day 2004, everybody knew on Election Day that Kerry had won. The exit poll showed it. There was very, very high turnout among Democrats. His approval rating, Bush's approval ratings were under 50%. Even Bush threw a tantrum and complained, how did he lose? That night, I came home from work, sat down to watch the news, and waiting to hear the results. I didn't hear anything on TV. I'm looking at the computer screens, and I see, sure, lo and behold, the exit polls are showing a decisive Kerry victory. Then, I was watching with a whole group of people. I say that to the group, and they say, well, that's not what they're reporting on TV, and I'm seeing two completely different stories. And the exit polls on the CNN website are showing that Kerry won decisively, and in Minnesota and Pennsylvania and Ohio was too close to call in Florida. And up on the screen is something altogether different, that basically that Kerry has lost. But, still after that, no real explanation came forward, and I started to look into it, and the more I looked, the more surprising I was. Really, I was in for a shock a day. I'll just mention three of the big shocks. I'm probably preaching to the choir about these things, but one was the voting systems. I mean, we have a voting system, electronic voting, which we're starting to win a battle against. But anyway, it's hard to design, it's hard to imagine a system more conducive to fraud. Just a quick, a good analogy is most people would recognize that it's not a good system, perhaps, to have something like where you go to vote, instead of writing directly who you're voting for, there's a red curtain there, and there's a man behind the curtain who you don't see, and instead of voting yourself, you tell him how you'd like to vote. Obviously, he may not hear you, he may make a mistake, or he may think he knows better than you how to vote, or he may have his own reasons for casting that vote differently. And most people recognize that. I mean, that's what we have with electronic voting. Only the programmers are the intermediaries and the companies that own the voting machines. And the only real difference is that instead of changing one vote, they can literally change millions of votes at a time. Second big shock in the system, and by the way, this is true for all voting machines. The only difference is that there is an audit trail in other machines, but that audit trail, when you actually try to access it, and we have many people who are trying to, there is hurdle after hurdle thrown. For example, it was a big thing that Ohio now has supposedly an audit trail, but they've raised the cost to $500,000 for any losing candidate to request a statewide audit of the election. The second big shock were the exit polls themselves. This was no illusion. There was a 7 percentage point disparity nationwide that amounts to between 9 to 10 million votes in the presidential election. Rather than winning by 120,000 votes, the exit polls showed that George Bush lost Ohio by 500,000. Rather than winning nationally by 3 million, the exit polls indicate that he lost by between 6 and 7 million votes. And no substantiated explanation has come forth. I mean, the only possible explanation for this is that Bush voters disproportionately refused to participate in the polls, or didn't participate in the polls for whatever reason. But the data indicate otherwise. If that were the case, then you would expect to see lower, it's a little complicated, just lower participation rates in precincts in states where Bush voters predominated. Instead, they're slightly higher in those precincts. Meanwhile, every indicator of a corrupted count is bailed out. The disparity was significantly higher in battleground states, significantly higher yet in the critical battleground states, Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania. It's higher where there's Republican governors, higher where there are election day problems, higher where there's more African Americans, higher where they control the jurisdictions. And the third big point is outright evidence of malfeasance. In Ohio, for example, there was the Orwellian recount talking about the value of a paper trail on these things. Supposedly, Ohio, in fact, the Libertarian and Green Party paid for a recount, where 3% were supposed, 3% of precincts in every county were supposedly randomly audited. If there was any disparity, the entire county would be counted. In 88 counties in Ohio, there was not one vote off between the machines and the audits, and that's because they had what they referred to themselves as cheat sheets to show exactly what numbers they ought to come up with. And you know, in some places, they actually, observers saw Kerry voters covered up with stickers. There were secret counts. It was just absolutely Orwellian. And as far as random selection, Kenneth Blackwell defined random as those precincts that he chose. There were equivalent shocks in the media, this being a media conference. I mean, these began the day after the election. Those exit poll data that I was looking at on election night, I went back the next morning to look at them and thinking, you know, what happened with these? And I see altogether different numbers. And I'm wondering, did I remember this right? What happened? And it turns out that the way the exit poll that we see is conducted by a single consortium of 6 major media groups, all the major broadcasters and Associated Press. And what they do is, as soon as the count comes in, they correct the exit poll so as to conform with the count. So those numbers disappeared. In fact, we only know of it because of technical glitch and because there was a very astute observer that night who's here, Jonathan Simon, who actually recorded all those screenshots from election night. There's just even though it's the media that conducted it, there's an absolute total lack of transparency in this. And they refuse to report on the data. They refuse to give it to a group of academics from University of Pennsylvania and Columbia. They refuse to give it to Congressman John Conyers. They refuse to share it with other pollsters. And the claim is this is proprietary data. Lack of independent investigation. It's partly economics, but not just that. I mean, there's a lot of things that newspapers could do that perhaps would be viable. And it's not just a matter of trusting the Democrats. There's a vicious cycle where the Democrats, the media refuses to investigate because the Democrats don't contest the election, but John Kerry doesn't want to contest the election because he's afraid he's going to be eaten alive in the media. Then there's, you know, fear. There's this assumption that, well, you can't do anything without proof. But of course, you know, that turns the presumptions on their head. We ought to not have, you don't have to presume it's a clean election. We ought to, if there's any doubts, that doubt ought to be shown without question that in fact it is clean. Any doubt ought to be absolutely proven beyond reasonable that it is a clean election. So we have exactly the backwards set of presumptions about that. You know, just to really wrap up now in conclusion, you know, without fair elections, almost everything else that we do politically is in vain. So there's some, in 2006, there's some evidence, it's still early in these analyses, but there's some evidence that there was significant skewing of votes. In fact, in the words of John Simon, a landslide denied. We don't have it fully documented yet, but you know, this may have happened in 2006 too, and such meta victories as we just heard about are unlikely to happen in the future. On the other hand, election reform is a winnable battle. You know, if you actually look at values, there's no question, but that almost everybody concurs that the counts ought to be what voters say ought to dominate.